Hey, podcast listeners, although not exactly sexually explicit, this episode does involve a lot of discussion of the genitals of mythical raccoon dogs.
He switched on the light, which was illuminating his garden. And in this garden, I saw 20 raccoons sitting in the center of the garden. And one of these 20 was my radio-collared male.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
And we should put a scrotum grinder song on this podcast. Yeah, the friend Michelle song for them.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find it real quick.
Well, while Tony's looking up scrotum grinder, I'll do the intro stuff. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. This is one of your co-hosts, Billy Brown, with other co-host
Tony Crosdale
and guest host
Christian Arnold.
And we're going to talk about our urban mesofauna neighbors.
That's right. That's cute, small, little furry animals that run around your streets and backyards.
Not as small as squirrels, but not as big as coyotes and stuff.
Well, although coyotes are sort of knocking on the door.
35 pounds, yeah. So, like, the things that are, like, as big as your cat or your small dog or medium-sized dog?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, up to maybe pit bull size.
Here we go.
How would you categorize this?
I'd say probably power violence is the genre most associated. We'd probably call it power violence. Maybe grindcore, maybe just fast hardcore, but probably power violence.
I love that there's these names that every time I hang out with you, there's a new genre I've never even heard of. Had you heard of power violence before?
I have not, no.
And you're into, like...
I mean, grindcore and hardcore, yeah.
Yeah.
Man is the bastard
Power
invented
violence,
power
yeah.
violence.
Okay. What distinguishes that from other kinds of hardcore, if you're like...
Power violence...
Oh, this is power violence.
Power violence is known for kind of having, like, swings in tempo. They go real fast, and then they kind of go, like... Joom, 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 and, like, you know...
Okay.
They kind of, like, have the and usually power violence, I don't know if the bass is usually turned up pretty high in the mix.
Okay.
So...
There you go.
There you go, yeah.
And they're usually political, but, like, a little bit more, like, angsty political, but still very political. It's still very, like they're angry at the right stuff and they're righteous, but, like, they might personalize it a little bit, you know?
Okay.
Like, not just, like, a list of, like... I mean, it's definitely punk bands. It's basically, like, read a manifesto about a certain issue.
Mm.
They'll basically be, like... It's kind of like how I feel living in this system, you know?
Okay.
You know, sensitive guys.
So if you're feeling grumpy about the political system or other things getting you down and channeling that through power violence music, check out our podcast. Share it with your friends. We encourage you to tell your friends about the podcast if you like it. Go onto your podcasting platform of choice and rate us so other people can find us and love us just like you do. And get in touch with us to tell us what you think of the podcast or give us some ideas at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. Twitter handle UrbWildlifeCast, and hit us up on Facebook. And so this episode came about because last year when we were doing a podcast episode, we were talking about crazy topics in urban wildlife. And Tony said, well, what about the Nazi raccoons? And we all said, what the hell are you talking about? And Tony talked about how that the idea of it was that the Nazis in some central way had decided to introduce raccoons into Germany to improve the fauna, but the reality was a little bit more nuanced than that. We're going to get into it. And that got me thinking about raccoons as a general topic. Raccoons both where they're native, and so we're going to hear about some research into intelligence is like the easy word for it, but more precisely sort of performance on different cognitive tests between urban raccoons versus rural raccoons. And we're going to hear a little bit about the expansion of raccoons into Germany, including into some German cities. And then in chatting with podcast guest host and general friend in nature circles around Philadelphia, Christian Hunold, we realized that you're actually from sort of Raccoon Ground Zero.
That is right, yeah.
In Germany.
Raccoons have reached my hometown back in Germany, and my parents and other people in the town who have gardens.
What town is it?
The town is called Detmold. They have to sort of get used to the presence of raccoons and learn things like bringing the bird feed inside at night and putting bungee cords on their trash cans and stuff like that they never had to do before.
Yep.
Because, raccoons.
They
I like raccoons. Sexy.
What do you mean? The pronunciation?
We go raccoons. He's like raccoons.
We looked it up, and the story is a little more complicated than just Hitler and company releasing raccoons. It was that, and so I had some recording troubles when I was talking to, I'm always having trouble pronouncing, Dr. Homan.
Mm-hmm. This is really reminded me when you're like, it's sort of more complex than that. After we're like just talking about like Nazi raccoons, you're like, sorry, it's actually more complex than that. It reminds me of that great scene in Half Baked when they're like,
I haven't seen that in a long time.
They're talking about they find the Rottweiler dead, and they're like, I bet like Samson's men came in here with like nunchucks and like ninjas, and they killed the dog. And like, someone's like, I think it's more complex than that. They show like more complex than that, and he goes into this whole, and then like Jim Brewer goes into this whole story about like how the dog was raised by like this like Rottweiler fight promoter and like this whole conspiracy, and like, but it's like kind of like that. It's like more complex than Nazi leadership wanting to improve the fall of Germany. No, more complex than that.
This is more accidental, less coordinated than that. This is where a regional game official sort of wanted to release raccoons from a fur farm to give people, sort of something to hunt and sort of fur-bearing species out in the woods. So it was nothing sort of centrally decided about it, but it did happen at the beginning of the Nazi era. And then after World War II, people started getting more reports about the raccoons sort of eating your fruit off your fruit trees kind of thing. And then starting in the 1950s, they opened up official hunting of raccoons as a game species. Mm-hmm. And so that's where Dr. Homan picks it up, sort of talking about sort of how that was provided early documentation of their extent and then their spread, because you could document how many hunters killed them and mm-hmm. where. So it gives you a good record of them.
What the statistics tell us up to now is that the raccoon seems to have problems in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to the 80s to get established in Europe. So the hunting bags were quite low, something around 100, several hundred, up to 1,000, not more, all over Germany and even all over Europe, because at that time the raccoon almost only occurred in Germany. So all the hunted raccoons in the first 20 years or first 30 years, almost all raccoons that got shot by somebody got shot around these release sites in the 30s. So there was a strong indication that the spread of the population seems to be hindered by something that we at that time didn't understand, why the raccoon spread so slowly. Today we have a fairly good idea why they spread so slowly, but at that time nobody really understood what's going on. And then in the 80s, in the 90s, and especially in the last 20 years, the raccoon population has something like an explosion. We record at the moment something around 100,000 raccoons hunted each year. And if you compare that with several hundred raccoons just 40 years ago, that gives you an idea of the well-being of that new mammal in Germany, especially in Germany. But at the moment, also many other countries in Europe have raccoons on a much lower level than in Germany. Germany is still the country with the highest population in Europe, but they start to go into France, Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic, Poland. And
what was it that hindered their expansion before and then changed to allow it?
Yeah, that is a good question. And we think the females in raccoons and that was a common knowledge in the States as well as our research here in Germany, that doesn't matter whether American raccoons or European raccoons, the females stay close to the mother's home range. We call it philopatric behavior. And it's the male usually that spreads, that migrates. And in an area where raccoons were new, where they have to populate the area, to colonize the area, this behavior doesn't make sense because the males just walk away from the mother's home range into nowhere. They won't find any females. But the raccoons didn't know that. So they behave like they behaved many 100,000 years before. They follow this specific male behavior. They start migrating, maybe 10 kilometers, maybe 20 kilometers. Some raccoon males may have even migrated more than 100 kilometers, but it doesn't make sense because they didn't find any conspecifics to mate with. And this makes sense because if you look on the hunting statistics, you find more away from the former release sites, you mostly found young males, and that's it. Maybe a hunter was killing a raccoon many kilometers away from the release sites in the 60s or in the 70s. He found it was a male, and then nothing happened for maybe another 10 years. And then again, a male was captured or killed. So it took some time, it took decades, till the females were following the males. And the moment the females reached an area, then the population can really start getting established. And that makes it so slow.
So what happens when in their expansion, I mean, I guess they're starting off released into forest. What has happened in Germany when the females, reach, or the next generation sort of reaches the edge of a city? Do they end up being urban animals like they are typically in North America?
Yes, right. When I did my PhD in the 90s, we didn't really know much about urban raccoons. And I was really very much fascinated when one of my radio-colored males were located on the edge of a small city. I was really crazy about that because I was reading all these papers on urban raccoons in Ohio, Toronto, Cincinnati, Washington, and I start feeling that something similar maybe is going to happen now in Europe. So I followed this male. He spent some weeks on the edge of the city, and on one night he was in the center of this small village. And I located the male in a garden, and I ringed on the door and asked the housekeeper whether he knew that a raccoon is in his garden. And he starts laughing at me and asked me to follow him. And we came to his sleeping room, and in his sleeping room there was a little switch on the wall, and he switched on the light, which was illuminating his garden. And in this garden I saw 20 raccoons sitting in the center of the garden. And one of these 20 was my radio-colored male. And in that moment I realized that it was just we researchers that didn't recognize that the urbanization of the raccoon has already reached a level like in the States. But he was absolutely familiar with these raccoons because he started feeding them since several years. So they start urbanizing much earlier than we knew. But at the moment we have a much better knowledge about that. So we can conclude that in Germany, especially in the central part of Germany, which is also very forested, almost all villages which were close to forests located might have a raccoon population. So it's maybe we reach levels like in the States. For example, in Kassel, which is the city with the probably highest raccoon population, urban raccoon population. In Kassel, we started research on population size and density, and we found out that it's pretty much the same like in the States. So something around 50 to 100 raccoons per square kilometer, which is pretty much the same densities that we found in Toronto or Washington.
So,
or Chicago.
How are they regarded? I mean, I guess there's officially and sort of by the public, are they a pest species that you're trying to control or eradicate, or are they just sort of a part of the local fauna now? Like, do people think of them as pests or endearing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But the German attitude on raccoons, I think, is not much different from that in America, that some people hate them, some people love them, and many people just don't really recognize that they are there. So I think there's a high variability in citizens how they regard raccoons. It could happen that you ask people in a city what they think about raccoons. One is telling you that they have raccoons every evening in the garden, and just the neighbor didn't even know that they have raccoons in Europe. So it could be very, very different from one house to the other.
Neat. Are there official government efforts to try to get rid of them or control them?
Yes, to control them in terms of conflict management. So in the very beginnings, the official authorities in the affected cities thought that capturing and just to take them out of the city by euthanizing the animals would be a solution. But then they really quickly start to realize that is not really effective. I think this pretty much the same happened in the States or in Canada. In Toronto, for example, they tried to eradicate the raccoon problem by just huge capturing programs, and then they start to realize that it just didn't work. And I think this pretty much the same happened here in Germany, that for example, the authorities in Kassel put much more emphasis on educating the public that raccoons in the city are natural, that they behave normally, that they are not sick, how to prevent them from getting into the house, what to do with food for the pets, how to get them out of the chimney and things like that. But capturing to kill them is probably not a very good, effective control measure because it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so this is something new to sort of Germans, where, I mean, mesopredators are pretty much limited to red fox. They're game species, and so they're usually hunted pretty intensely by the local hunters and never really develop the kind of population density that we sort of hear about in British cities or something.
How about badgers? Because they're
sorry. Well, badgers are always sort of low in number. Like they're never a species of animal that is sort of taking over the way that sort of mesopredators like raccoons can.
I just know in British cities.
Yeah, but there's
suburbs. A lot of
for some reason, badgers. I'm not aware of any areas in Germany where they've sort of multiplied in the way that they have in areas of Britain. And I think that's because hunting culture in Germany is probably a little bit more uniformly distributed.
Yeah, it's
than
not
in the UK. Like in the UK, there seems to be a real sort of
thing.
urban rural split.
It's a class thing too.
Well, it's a class thing as well. And in Germany, I think, talking about the Nazis, I think one of the consequences of the Nazi regime has been a sort of, one of the only, this is difficult to say, but one of the only socially progressive consequences of the Nazi regime is the destruction of the German class system, essentially, which basically did not survive World War II. So there's sort of relatively uniform hunting pressure on game animals in the country, and I think that so basically the point I guess the point I was trying to make is that so I think sort of for the first time a lot of people are having to learn how to sort of coexist with this sort of inquisitive, very dexterous sort of meso-mammal that never existed there before.
And they and so I sort of tracked the concept to Japan also, and we'll hear about that in a little bit, but that there are also raccoons established in Japan. In Japan, there had been a fad of keeping raccoons as pets after a certain like cartoon that involved a kid who had a pet raccoon. And of course, if you know about raccoons, they start off really cute, but a full-grown raccoon is actually kind of formidable.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I have friends who have raccoons as pets. And,
really?
Yeah, and it's
There's that West Philly guy for a while.
It's a lot of work. You probably, I mean, it can be done, but you want a very young raccoon. You want to separate them from their mother as early as possible, and you want to make sure it's a sort of a human-raised raccoon, as it were. And then they're sort of, I mean, they're sort of pretty inquisitive animals to begin with, and they're sort of pretty smart. But yeah, I mean, it's a pet that you can never really force it to do anything you want. So you have to sort of adjust to its likes and dislikes and preferences.
But they're strong.
Yeah, they're very strong. You can't physically dominate it.
Yeah, an angry raccoon is like...
An angry raccoon is a force to be reckoned with.
Have you seen that video go around of it's a raccoon and a possum interacting over like with the guy talking?
Yeah, like the guy doing the narrating from the raccoon's perspective.
Yeah, like, why don't you try some of this over here? Get some of that beverage in that cool container. Yeah, it's so good.
Matt Alt is an American expat in Japan who does translation and some other stuff. You'll hear him introduce himself. But he'd also written some articles about Tokyo wildlife in English language publications in Japan, so I found him that way. He's just like a general naturalist guy who loves nature. We didn't include it in this one, but he talked about the stag beetles and rhinoceros beetles in Japan and how kids will use those in like little fighting contests. Since then, Tony and I think we're looking up and we found out they have vending machines. You can get anything in a vending machine in Japan apparently, but included you can get live rhinoceros beetles so that you and your friends can have rhinoceros beetle competitions.
Handy.
But he was talking about sort of what I think of as like the urban mesofauna. So we've got, like in Australia, we've got somebody later on who's going to talk about the native possums without an O in the front.
That's right.
And they sort of fit into that niche, omnivores that'll live in your attic.
Yes.
You're saying besides deer, right?
Yeah, but the things that are like...
things that are sort of interestingly sort of inside, outside, and sort of raise interesting questions about sort of place and belonging and so on and so forth.
Spoken like a true social scientist.
Correct. Emma Powers has written a wonderful article about the possums in Australia. Actually, that's sort of about that. And how homeowners... it's sort of a study she interviewed maybe... if I remember it correctly, a couple of dozen homeowners in Australia and how they sort of negotiate coexistence with, or reject coexistence with native possums.
Yeah.
And some people, and it's a lot like how people deal with or react to the presence of raccoons or Virginia opossums in North America, right?
Yeah.
So some people are sort of totally happy to have them running around wild in their attic, or sort of show up to eat with the cats, in the backyard, and other people can sort of call pest control and freak out and have them removed. And
some people will be like...
insist on a sort of very sort of, Trump-style border wall, if you want, between sort of inside and outside.
Support the raccoon!
That's right, yeah. And so Australians have a sort of, mirror, I think, in that sense, the whole range of sentiments about to what extent their presence inside the home is acceptable or not.
And everything you're saying, you could just swap out possum for raccoon.
Yes.
Talking about the United States and Canada.
Yeah, correct.
Pretty interesting in Australia now. People seem to be having these relationships with kookaburras.
The birds?
Yeah. Coming in, like, eating from their barbecue, and like, they're feeding them sausages, and they're hanging out in their patios and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. But but with raccoons, I mean, in Philadelphia, I feel like I get a mix of reactions where people are either pleasantly surprised and like, oh, how cute. It's a cute raccoon with her babies.
Right.
And then you get the news articles, or you get the I feel like if you Google it and look it up, like in Philadelphia media, like every few years there's a round of news reports about raccoons in someone's attic in South Philly or North Philly. And some frantic lady who's like calling the cops about
Let's tell you my jury duty experience with raccoons.
Tell it again. I remember,
I was going to jury duty, and this is when I was in grad school, so I just could not do it, And then they just let you off, right? So there's a line you go in to talk to a clerk or whatever and plead your case for why you can't do jury duty. And the woman in front of me was like, and they were making noise, and they were making a hole in the roof. And the woman was like, okay, and she let her out of jury duty for raccoons in a roof. But she was going off. She's like, this raccoon. I was like, man, I'm in grad school, and my life's hell right now.
Yeah, and there's
Did you get off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm Matt Alt. I'm a writer and translator based in Tokyo, and together with my wife Hiroko, we run a company that localizes video games and manga and things like that into English and other languages. Well, I think when you're talking about Tokyo, you have to ask yourself, are you talking about Tokyo as in like kind of the inner city of Tokyo, or are you talking about Tokyo as the metropolitan area, which is obviously a lot bigger and it's kind of surrounding suburbs? If you're talking about Tokyo as in the city of Tokyo, which is like within the 23 wards of Tokyo, as it's called, which as foreigners like to think of it as kind of within the Yamanote Line train that circles the entire city, that kind of central area, that's very built up and very urbanized. So, of course, what you're going to be seeing a lot more of things like rats, crows, cockroaches, that sort of thing, seagulls, because it is near the bay, that sort of thing. But that said, there are some kind of unique animals and critters to Asia that you can occasionally find even in the big city. And I think this is about 5 years ago or so, there was a big to-do about a palm civet cat that had somehow worked his way downtown and was running around inside a subway station.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and these are palm civet cats, which are called hakubishin in Japanese, are really interesting kind of animals. They're called cats, but they actually look kind of like stretched out raccoons. To me, and they're very common in Japan, and they occupy much of the same niche, ecologically speaking, that raccoons would in the West, kind of foraging for garbage in urban areas and things like that. But yeah, so you see things like that, and also, especially as you get more out toward the suburban areas, not so much downtown, but you'll actually see things like monkeys. There are actually monkeys very near Tokyo, like certainly in the Hachioji area, which is out west. Which you can see from time to time. And in certain areas of Japan, not in Tokyo certainly, but in certain areas of Japan, they're actually big pests in suburban areas. The tanuki is a Japanese, it's often translated as raccoon dog. And so tanuki are canids, and they very much physically, at a quick glance, resemble raccoons, except for the fact they don't have those striped tails. And they are...
They're one of the cutest things anyone's ever seen. I mean...
Oh, yeah, they're great. They're great. No, we actually... And we have tanuki living in our neighborhood. We've actually come home late at night and find them, hanging out on our steps, or not even doing any damage or anything, just because, our garbage in our neighborhood, the garbage is usually really pretty sealed away, so I'm not exactly sure what they're subsisting on out there. But tanuki are also really interesting because they're an integral part of Japanese folklore. In Japanese folklore, tanuki occupy the space that in many American Indian cultures the raven does, kind of a trickster and a shapeshifter. And so you'll have all of this huge amount of stories in Japanese folklore about tanuki tricking people or disguising themselves as people and to get into places and things like that. So there's this kind of, Japan has a kind of love-hate relationship with them. I guess in sort of much the way Americans do with raccoons.
Just thinking of things they might subsist on, I mean, I'm guessing you guys have rats and mice.
Absolutely. We have rats and mice, certainly fruits on trees and things like that.
Okay.
There's a lot of fruit trees out there.
I'm going to ask you about one more thing. When you mentioned tanuki and you start Googling them,
yes.
One of the first things you come up with, better to have someone who knows it better than I talk about it.
Okay.
The mythology around their scrotums.
Yes. Tanuki are famed in Japanese folklore for having these giant and I guess you could say transformable scrotums, where in folklore you will see tanuki taking their scrotums and wrapping themselves up in them to transform into other forms, or drawing them over their heads to kind of shelter themselves from the rain. And it's actually, in folklore, there's an actual physical size given to them that it can extend, the tanuki scrotum can extend some 8 tatami mats in size. And a tatami mat is a pretty large, it's about a meter by a half meter rectangle. So you can imagine 8 of those together. That's a pretty big surface area. Now, this is everybody knows this. This is a quote unquote fact that everybody knows about tanuki in Japan. But in reality, and so when I first saw a tanuki, the first thing I did was try to maneuver around behind and do they really have big testicles? And they don't. They don't at all. And Hiroko and I, my wife, we actually write quite a bit about Japanese folklore. We co-authored a book called Yokai Attack, the Japanese Monster Survival Guide. And it's full of monsters from Japanese folklore, not Godzilla and things like that, but actual folkloric monsters, of which the tanuki we put in there is one. And when we researched it, we realized that the association between balls and testicles and tanuki came about because gold workers in times of old, to make gold leaf, would actually use tanuki pelts to pound it out. You can't just hammer on an ingot of gold to make gold leaf. You need something soft to be pounding on to make it super thin, right?
Yep.
Now, in Japan, the slang word for testicles, of course there's scientific words and things like that, but medical words, but the slang word that everybody uses is kintama, which means golden balls. So the association between gold, in the sense of these gold leaf makers using tanuki pelts to hammer out the gold, and balls and tanuki all became kind of mixed together in people's minds. And starting in the 1800s, they became kind of a symbol of prosperity. Which is why you see little tanuki statues out front of a lot of Japanese restaurants and hotels and things like that.
Because of their association with gold. I got it. Okay.
Association with gold and the association with the ball sacks and all this sort of thing. So you will see large scrotumed tanuki statues. Very common. If you look up tanuki statue, I'm sure you'll find it. They're standing right
believe me, I have.
Yes.
And to be also clear, this is not, I mean, in the States, you hear this kind of thing and you think, oh my God, that's sexually obscene, but this is more just comical in Japan.
Yes. I think it's kind of key to say that until Westerners kind of started sailing into Japanese harbors, Japanese were very comfortable with nudity.
So we're just looking quickly at some tanuki, some historic Japanese tanuki raccoon dog cartoons showing tanuki using their enormous scrotums for shelter, like a giant wrinkly tent with some hair on it, and other historic.
I've seen them using it as parachute to
We got parachutes here. I think they're using them to catch fish in a river.
So these are what? What era are these?
I think these are 1800s, 1840 illustrations.
The parachute was in a fairly recent cartoon, but yes.
The Japan though part, I was like, okay, there's raccoons in Japan, but in Japanese cities they have what we would call raccoon dogs, and so I just was like, okay, we'll have to follow that up, and so that's how I ended up talking to Matt, and Matt also mentioned something called a palm civet. The palm civets were introduced to Japan in the 1800s. I'm not sure why, but another sort of the kind of thing that'll live in your attic. Also, on the raccoon beat, it's hard to research urban raccoons without coming across Susan McDonald's work, looking at, again, you try to avoid loaded words like intelligence, but
Franz Waal calls it evolutionary cognition, to avoid the intelligence and consciousness conundrum. So he sort of says, well, animals have to be able to solve problems they encounter in daily life.
Yeah.
And what those problems are obviously sort of differs. The raccoon is sort of different set of problems from a chimp or a human.
Yeah.
But it all involves some form of cognition, right?
Yeah.
Some ability to sort of understand perhaps causation or
puzzle solving,
some tool use in more and more species.
Sure, I'm Dr. Suzanne MacDonald. I'm a professor at York University here in Toronto. I am professor of psychology and biology, so I study animal behavior.
Great. And so how did you come to do research on urban raccoon intelligence?
Well, raccoons have actually been studied by psychologists for over 100 years, but they actually were studied at the beginning of the 1900s and then not again because they're really difficult to work with. I started looking at them, frankly, because I was asked to be on a TV show for Nature talking about raccoons because I study mammals and I'm a psychologist. And I realized we don't really know that much about raccoons in the city, and even though they live in our backyards, and that seems crazy. So about 5 years ago, I started in trying to rectify that. So the first study we did, which was actually for the nature show, was to put GPS collars on some raccoons and track them in the city to see where they went and to see how big their home ranges were, because we didn't really know. So that was a really interesting study. We had every 20 minutes we would have a little ping from the collar, so we would know in very fine detail where these animals spent their time for about a month, and it was amazing. And after that, that was done with one of my grad students, and after that I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do this crazy study on my own. And I got funding from National Geographic, which was amazing, and went out and spent 120 nights watching raccoons in forests and also in downtown Toronto. And yep, my friends think I'm insane.
I don't.
Okay. Well, maybe they think that I'm insane for other reasons, but, I would go to parties downtown and go, hey, do you mind if I just go out in your backyard while the party's going on and set up an experiment and put some cameras in? And they're like, yeah, okay. So after a while, they got used to it. That's all I can say. It was fun.
So I guess how do you design, what kind of experimental design do you use to test relative intelligence?
Well, it's a really hard question because we don't even know what intelligence is, really. I mean, how do you define it? My hypothesis is, and was, it still is, that the urban environment is shaping raccoons so that the urban raccoons are different in some way that denotes intelligence compared to their country cousins who don't have the same selection pressure on them to be smart and to figure out how to get into garbage cans and do all those things that urban raccoons have to do. So my study was I wanted to compare rural animals and urban animals on a couple of problem-solving tasks just to see if there were any differences. So that's what I did. I made up 2 tasks that were easy enough. I had to have something portable that I could take all over the Toronto area and then also all over southern Ontario, and that I could clean in between. And, there's all these requirements for making these stupid tasks. So I had tried to build all these extraordinary things. I ended up with a garbage can with a bungee cord over it, over the top, over the lid, and then I made up this crazy novel hanging thing out of a garbage can hanging upside down so that nobody had ever seen anything like that. No raccoon had seen anything like that. And the tasks were designed, or at least I designed them, to be, one was easier than the other. So the food was easier to get at. You only had to make one little brain. You had to think about one thing. You had to do one thing to get the food from one of them, and you had to make 2 leaps of intelligence to get the food from the other task. And so I put them both out for raccoons in the city, and then I put them out all over southern Ontario for rural raccoons, and found that the urban raccoons were wildly different than their country cousins were.
How are they wildly different?
Well, I will tell you. So on the easy task, the one-stage task, all the raccoons in the city and the country were the same. So they all figured it out, and they all did similar things, and there was no problem with that task at all. Even though it was a really weird task, it hung and it swung in a weird way, and even the country raccoons were a little spooked by it, but they all figured it out, and they all had fun with it, actually. They were all flinging it all over the place. I'm not there, obviously. I had motion camera traps up so that I wasn't there. There were no people there when these tasks were done. I just watched the video afterwards and laughed. And then the second task, which was the garbage can with the bungee cord, it's actually a 2-step task because when you put food in the bottom of a garbage can, what an animal does is smell around the bottom of the garbage can because that's where the food is. But a raccoon in the city does more than that. So the rural raccoons actually go all the way around the outside of the can over and over and over again, smelling the food, and then they kind of have a sort of half-hearted attempt to open the lid, and then they walk away. But the urban ones smell the food, immediately go to the top of the garbage can and start trying to figure out how to get into it. The reason I chose the garbage can with the bungee cord is because rural animals actually experience that as well. I wasn't out in the middle of like forests. I was in areas that had people, but that have no regular garbage collection. So that was my definition of rural. So that there's no predictable, routinized garbage that's out for them, so that they don't rely on human food. But everybody in the country actually puts their garbage in a garbage can and puts the bungee cord on the top. So it turns out the reason they do that is because rural animals can't figure that out. Not all the urban animals actually did. About 80% of the urban animals did, but 0 of the rural animals figured out that task. Oh, I did it for 2 summers, and so last year and the year before.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned before that raccoons are hard to work with. Why are they hard to work with?
Oh, well, they have toxic poop, and they do carry rabies, and they're a wildlife species. They're protected, so you're not going to keep them in captivity. And they bite, and, they're raccoons. So they're large, and they're not easy. You don't pick them up. They're not an animal that you want to mess around with. Yeah, if you've ever, when we had to put when we had to put the collars on to track them, we had to get them in little squeeze cages so the veterinarian could anesthetize them so we could get the collar on and then wake them up again. And my God, they're little balls of fury when you do that. So you don't really want to get too close to a raccoon.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I've seen some bruisers around here.
Yeah, they look bigger than they are because a lot of it is fur, but they are still, some of the males can be very big, and all of them have very good teeth, so you don't want to get near that.
When you were talking about selective pressure, so do you think this is a question of evolved behavioral differences, or just the environment developing? Is this a question of sort of nature or nurture?
Well, that's the question. So The only way to answer that definitively is now my follow-up study is going to be to look at infant raccoons. So raccoons stay with their mom for the first couple months, and they don't forage. She feeds them. They don't forage, and they're often in the city and in rural areas as well. That's when they're removed from environments, so they go to these wildlife centers for rehab, and they keep the young ones there until they're old enough. So I actually can get access to some city babies and some country babies, and that's the way to look at it, because then you'll know whether it's genetic or whether it's nurture, because none of them have had any experiences foraging at that point. The reason I want to do that is because I did have some infants and young ones attempt my tasks, and the difference between the urban and the rural animals was there in the young ones as well. So it suggests to me that, this isn't just an experiential thing. This is something we're selecting for. And I don't know if it's actually intelligence, but certainly the behaviors that I recorded are different. So exploratory behavior is different. The animals in the rural areas are neophobic, so they're more afraid of new things, whereas the ones in the urban environment are neophilic. They approach new things right away. So those kinds of behaviors can be selected for, so they have been in other species as well, and that is documented in other animals, just not large mammals like raccoons. So that kind of boldness, that is a genetically determined trait, and it would make sense that that's what the urban environment is selecting for. So those animals that exhibit those traits will be more likely to survive and to get food and to have offspring, and then their genes will carry on, and those that don't exhibit those traits will not, and so their genes won't be in the gene pool anymore. A lot of times I'm sitting out there in the country getting eaten by mosquitoes thinking, I have made a very bad career choice at some point. Nobody forced me to do this, and yet here I am. So, not exactly the most glamorous of studies, but I'm glad now that I have about 800 hours of video, so I have a lot of video. And it was really fun. I was just amazed by the results to see how different these animals were. It was like they were two different species. I mean, if I didn't look at them, if I just recorded their behavior, I would think they were two different kinds of animals. They behave completely differently.
Do you have raccoons in your own yard?
Oh yes, I have raccoons in my own yard. Yes, I test all my potential tasks are all tested on my raccoons. So yep, they're very, very fat and very, very bold raccoons in my backyard.
And just one other little point of curiosity, what do you bait them with?
Oh, they love cat food a lot, so that's the easiest thing. So
Okay.
just a can of cat food. But if I really want to be nice, so for my raccoons in my yard, I use roast chicken. Oh yes, they love that. They love Kentucky Fried Chicken more than life itself, but I find it disgusting, so I don't buy it. Well, I tell you, the urban ones have absolutely no fear, and so I can test anything on the ones in my backyard. In fact, they wait for me to put it out, and then as soon as I put something out, they're there, and they're trying to explore it and figure it out, and they have buckets on their head, and it's hilarious, but, they are so smart and so, just engaged with stuff, and they can do that because they're not living in the country where they have to range over 10 kilometers to find food. I mean, they live in 3 square blocks their entire lives, so they have time on their hands. I think that explains why they try a lot of these new things. They got nothing else to do.
Seems like every day you open the paper, you find another story about sort of
Another magpie.
Amazing, or some of the a couple of I think the most sort of the one that stands out from the past year that I read about is a couple of raptors in Australia that intentionally start fires. The kite,
spread fires.
Yeah, it's a kite species and a hawk. They're two distinct raptors, and when they see brush fires, they know to pick up sort of burning twigs, embers, and sort of spread the fire to flush out more insects. So stuff like that, right? So, which is clearly has to involve, right? You can imagine that as a sort of instinct or innate behavior, but it's just sort of simpler to conclude that clearly there's some.
They figured it out.
Right? There's a connection between stuff is burning and the voles and mice and whatever start running for the hills.
That equals food.
Yes, yeah. So
more of it.
So I think evolutionary cognition as a term, I think, kind of makes sense because it sort of is sort of neutral. Like it avoids that loaded idea, and it sort of avoids the urge to compare, animal cognition to human cognition and how they're different and how they're similar, which always ends up in this sort of, endless sort of knot and probably isn't particularly helpful to really understand a particular species cognition. So I like that.
So tell us about speaking of urban birds and their challenges, you got a paper?
I have a paper coming out about urban hawks, and not really so much about the hawks themselves as their sort of relationship with the people that sort of observe them.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a multi-species ethnography, which is another one of those not very handy terms to describe an emerging academic field. But what people are trying what people are trying to do is sort of I think a very sort of serious thing, right? They're sort of asking how does our view of the environment that surrounds us changes? How does that view change if we take into account the fact that there are other species that sort of inhabit it, right? And that sort of have some sort of relationship with us, and we have some sort of relationship with them. Not in a sort of, romantic or nostalgic or in that sort of sense, but, there are relationships. Raccoons have learned how to open trash cans. And the urban hawks that I'm writing about, the ones that make it to adulthood anyway, have to figure out to avoid, how to avoid cars, how to avoid buildings, how to sort of avoid elements of their environment that, they haven't necessarily evolved to learn to avoid in the woods, right?
Yeah.
Where it's possible to fly into a tree maybe, but, you fall out of the nest and you end up, you land on some sort of more or less soft ground in the forest. If you fall out of the nest in Center City, Philadelphia, you land
from 8 stories up.
Yeah, you land on a hard sidewalk, right? Which is sort of likely to injure you. So
that's forgiving.
So there's sort of certain risks to the urban environment that they, especially when they're young, that they're not particularly well equipped to handle, like hard surfaces or reflective glass.
Yeah.
But once you start looking...
Moving vehicles.
Yeah, right, and moving vehicles. But once you start looking, there are, red-tailed hawks and Cooper's hawks and so on just about anywhere in the city.
It's true.
So clearly, the sort of cost-benefit calculus sort of works out for them, right? The sort of supply of food at all times of the year, rats, pigeons.
But is it still a live question whether it's a sink? Like, are young hawks moving into the city?
See, that we don't know.
Setting up a nest and then not succeeding very well?
No, they're succeeding extremely well. There is actually research that suggests that this is a study done in Minneapolis, which is obviously a smaller city than Philadelphia, but it does have an urban core.
They have buildings.
And the nests, they did a nice comparative study where they found that the nests in the urban core were on average more productive than nests in the suburban or rural areas.
Didn't Rob find that with the barred owls in Charlotte, that they're actually more successsul in the suburban?
And it's because food is never a constraint. Like, it's relatively independent of weather. It's relatively independent of seasons.
We got squirrels.
Yeah, pigeons, rats. I mean, there's some seasonal foods but they almost seem like supplements, like the goslings or something in May.
Yeah.
Like, if they didn't exist, it wouldn't matter.
I'm going to see them hunt goslings. That's so awesome.
Sorry?
I'm going to see them hunt goslings.
Yeah, no, it is pretty awesome. Yeah,
you got to see them? Take them?
Going to a bank, it's like going to a...
Have you seen it yourself?
Yeah, they just basically go...
So you don't just study the hawk watchers, you spend quality time watching the hawks.
Yes.
For photographs, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So you get sort of...
some of your pictures of hawks in Philadelphia are kind of famous among nature people.
Yeah, you get to know the hawks, and the hawks get to know you.
Good, when I write my next Parks and Rec article, it was going to be about hawks, and I hit you up for some photos.
Yeah, no.
You got to get the one of the hawk carrying the dead squirrel. Which building is that? Is that the
Franklin Institute.
Franklin Institute,
yeah.
Across the Franklin Institute.
To the nest, yeah.
Payable in drinks or
sure.
pizza.
No, yeah. We have this fine...
He takes bourbon.
Fine bourbon.
So the multi-species ethnography.
Yeah. It's sort of an attempt to, I think, to sort of decenter the human part of it, to sort of... I mean, all of it, I think, is to some extent a response to an article by Jennifer Walsh, I think published in around 2000, where she sort of said, look, we've built these cities, and we've built them for people, and we've had sort of, the sanitary city and, infrastructure, urban infrastructure that's basically sort of designed to separate us from the rest of nature, whether you think about sewers or roads or buildings, right? And this sort of
fences,
a very strong sort of inside-outside, inside we're sort of safe, and outside is the potentially sort of, it's our waste and bacteria and rats.
And the cold.
Yeah. So all, sort of what sort of human habitation is sort of about. Yet, in the late 20th century, I think it became, and I think this is sort of a big kind of historical transformation, where in the sort of industrial cities, if you sort of the high industrial age of the 1950s and 1960s, there were in many ways not a lot of animals in Western cities.
Do we know that, or no one was looking?
Well, I think we know it, and it's not entirely clear whether it's a result of just the sort of high levels of pollution and industrial activity, or whether it's a sort of delayed effect of just the sheer deforestation of the 19th century, which in many ways sort of removed the connection between sort of wildlife habitat and
this came
urban
up in
areas.
School discussions that it wasn't that you have sort of when you have wooded streets basically connecting with
and so what happens in the second half of the 20th century, at least in eastern North America, which is the case I sort of know best, is the forest comes back, right? Because of because lots of reasons. One is the sort of the disappearance of agriculture for the most part from the American Northeast.
I literally was writing about this like earlier today, because I'm writing an article about owls for Parks and Rec. I was talking about barn owls. And saying that they're declining, and one of the reasons was because it's in a way a good thing, because the forests they're an open country bird.
That's right, yeah.
So the forests have returned, and then the farms have gotten replaced by cities.
That's right. But because of the return of the forest, a lot of sort of more woodland species can now kind of move back.
Yeah.
It's not quite the right term because they've sort of been there before.
But
they can move into cities, right?
Yeah. Well, it's the gray squirrel story, basically.
Yeah. It's the gray squirrel, it's the fox story, it's the coyote story.
In New England, the fishers,
and maybe soon the black bear story, who knows?
Well, I mean, if you're going to not be snooty about the definition of a city, and, you know, Billy and I always joke about...
We're snooty.
Because Philly is so unbelievable. We have this definition of there's Philly proper and then there's suburbs. But our suburbs are like other cities' city. And black bears live in suburban New Jersey. They're part of the ecosystem of suburban New Jersey.
Yeah.
And,
Correct.
You know?
I was thinking about the fishers. It just in more than one city, or more than an urban area, including urban areas in Germany, I think. No, and certainly Switzerland. I think Germany would have the pine martens that attack people's cars.
Yes, there's two kinds of marten in Europe, the stone marten and the European pine marten.
I'm sorry, stone marten, yeah.
And it's the stone marten, I think, that is, that tends to be a little bit
Stoned.
more... What's the... It's not stoned. What's the term? The synanthropic?
Yeah.
So they tend to sort of like...
You got the chance to put the hook in there.
That's right.
Synanthropic organism.
They like dwellings, and they like they like sort of human built structures, and they're attracted to the sort of, actually I see this in my cats. They're sort of attracted to the aromatic hydrocarbons, I guess, in rubber, and it's irresistible.
And so apparently what they do is the males in breeding season will pee on the insides of cars, basically, in the hoses and stuff.
And they chew through the rubber hoses.
But apparently what gets them to chew through it is when you move the car from one male's territory to another.
Okay.
And so new male smells old male.
And go bonkers.
And then goes bonkers on all the scented territory inside this car. And they end up ripping up the insides of... there's this video, we'll try to find it. I think it was... Audi engineers like releasing stone martens inside cars in labs with cameras on them to try to figure out how they
what they can damage. Yeah.
I'd tell you about at Heinz, when I was at John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge, the intern. There was another seasonal guy from a different program who was like a seasonal biological intern, and they put him up in temporary housing, and he. In the Corbin Suites, and he got his where he was renting it, but he had a short-term lease, and his stick shift Dodge Dakota got stolen because you can roll it and start it with stick shift. So they stole his Dakota, and he got with insurance money, he got a not brand new, but a real nice shiny black Super Forester. And when he would park it at Heinz, the male turkeys would see their reflection in the shiny black Forester and attack it, and they would just scratch it to hell because he got those with the Halex.
Couldn't catch a break, you know.
Yeah, he just attacked his super. He went away for a training or something. He comes back and his super's scratched to hell. These turkeys attacking their own reflection in it. It's crazy.
Raccoons. Any good raccoon sightings to mention?
Well, I mean, one of the last. Well, let me just put it this way. I work in a large
raccoon-rich place.
Except I rarely see raccoons.
Oh yeah.
You know?
They're so secretive, or are you so?
I see their sign. I see their footprints all over our windows and our suet feeders and stuff. But and if I'm trying to remember, have I seen one even in my own park? The last one I know for sure was FDR, which is like a manicured park in South Philly. You know, and I see them in West Philly. I see raccoons more often in the residential areas, even for Philadelphia standards, the most residential like areas in Philadelphia than I do in my massive wild park.
Yeah, well, that's where the food is, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So my parents in Germany recently realized that their suet was disappearing every night. They have these sort of hollowed out, coconuts or something, and filled with suet, and tied to a bush, like coconut shells.
Yeah, I just hadn't thought I heard those first. Right.
And they kept disappearing. And so they were starting to get a little annoyed and got themselves a little trail cam and set up the trail cam overnight. And sure,
I love that your parents get trail just right.
Yeah.
Let's get a trail cam.
Yep. Amazon.
You can see how you,
yes.
but you can see how you were raised. You know that.
Yeah, that's right.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And so they set up the trail cam, and sure enough, two juvenile raccoons climbing into the little willow bush, and I guess they had tied down the suet a little bit more the day before, and so the raccoons weren't able to make off with it this time. But photographic proof that the raccoons were helping themselves to the free food. And
do they have rabid raccoon problems?
Well, there's rabies, but it's pretty rare in Germany for this sort of historically some sort of widespread sort of rabies treatment of wildlife.
Okay.
But as far as I know, rabbit raccoons are not yet.
They're a thing here. For sure.
They are, yeah. In my neighborhood, we had about 10 years ago. We had a rabbit raccoon.
And for context, your neighborhood looks like what?
Like it's a row house neighborhood. It's pretty urban, concrete everywhere.
Yeah. It's generous to say that you have a garden.
Yes. Yeah. Although collectively, right, the
middle of the block is like
the middle of the block is sort of an area that is like a half a soccer field or something like that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah.
And it's relatively close to Fairmont Park, and there's a railway corridor nearby. So they're sort of areas where, it's sort of a sufficiently rich sort of mix of habitats for all kinds of wildlife to
I love it. I heard that the railroads are really, really difficult to work with. But I'd love to approach them and be like, can I put up trail cams? Because I would love to see what uses.
Well, you could just do it. I mean, it's not like they would.
Yeah.
This is a question of getting stolen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you do it sort of...
Can you camouflage it really
If you do it far enough away from a sort of a crossroads, you could sit there for weeks without anybody noticing.
I herp railroad. I mean, I guess I don't know how much I hike along them, but I certainly look
at
embankments to find snakes and stuff.
In my...
It was once,
work,
once after 9/11, like maybe a couple of years after that, we hiked down sort of a quarter mile of railroad track, and a couple of railroad guys actually came out and sort of talked to us.
Yeah.
But that's happened once, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would be a regular thing.
I wonder if
they have cameras, I'm sure, but
I wonder where the rail line crosses was the Hicken Park, if I can get up there and be like, I'm in the park.
Yeah, sure.
That's also...
They're not going to work.
But you have a sort of a city job, right? So
Bring your binoculars and this is what we do with herpers, or at least I'll do, is I'll wear my nerdiest, like, reptile amphibian shirt, and I'll have, like, my Nature Conservancy hat.
Right.
And I'll, like, just to be like, look, I am not smuggling cocaine. Or trying to blow up a train.
Right.
I'm here to...
With me, it's the camera that usually gives it away.
Right, your camera is
not like a terrorist.
I've got here's my pictures of snakes right here. I took them today.
Sometimes though, camera is the thing they're worried about though, because they're worried you're like staking it.
Well, maybe. But.
There was an interesting thing in the paper about, and this to me says something about how we think about raccoons. Is that Darrell Clark, who's the head of city council, apparently introduced and got passed a bill that allows trapping of raccoons to then be released outside of Philadelphia. Because people don't like to think about having to kill them.
Right.
And it turns out that's illegal by state law, so it doesn't matter that it's a law in Philadelphia, you still can't do it. For me, that's it's the assumption that that it's something that doesn't belong here, you should release it out where it belongs.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So because the density of raccoons is incredible, right?
Well, they'll just slip right in.
Well, plus, I mean, the baseline density of raccoons in Philadelphia is probably 100 animals per square mile.
Much higher than rural area.
Yeah.
But also that the raccoon that you're catching in Philadelphia doesn't belong anywhere else. It grew up.
That's right, yeah.
Probably a house over or a block over from your house where you found it in your attic. The only thing really to do is just get it out of your attic, seal up your attic, and that's the best anyone can do.
Right. Killing them doesn't work. Or moving them doesn't.
That I wait on. So if I do a night program often, I'll catch the 9 instead of the 27, and at the 9 stop, there's a trash can, and the bus won't stop. The trash can is next to the bus shelter, and the bus pulls up, not next, like not the bus shelter, like a bus length away from it, because the trash can has raccoons always raiding it, and they don't want to move. People are scared of the raccoons. They don't want to wait with the bus shelter.
Oh, that's funny.
Wow.
And I'm like, not a problem.
Huh. It is interesting that these animals are sort of everywhere, and yet people are kind of afraid of them, right?
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, it's the rabies part I sort of get, right?
Yeah, but the thing
having,
is, feral cats are a huge rabies vector
having
too.
seen a rabbit raccoon, it's no fun, right? I mean, it's clearly it is a legitimately dicey situation where you can get hurt. So that makes sense to me.
I love them though.
But then the difference between a rabbit raccoon and a raccoon that evidently is not rabbit is like night and day, right? It's sort of
it slips away from you, and I've seen urban ones that don't seem like they're in a particular hurry to get away from you.
No, but
they just are still getting away from you.
Yeah. For the most part.
I think they're wonderful. I think they're just delightful.
Yeah,
I think they're some of the coolest looking animals on the planet.
They are.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and they live right here in our cities, and they're adorable, they're interesting, they have great behavior.
In my neighborhood in Fairmount, its reactions are very mixed, right? I mean, at least as far as I can sort of tell from sort of online, neighborhood message board discussions. Like, some people are clearly sort of enamored by them, and they love the fact that they hang out in their backyard, and they've known these raccoons forever, and they have sort of some sense of what their family structure is like. And then other people are sort of petrified, right? They are they going to sort of eat my cat, or I went into my backyard and the raccoon sort of wouldn't leave. And there's sort of a standoff.
So they'll back up from you a little bit.
Right, yeah.
Like,
so it's a sort of
I'm gonna watch you.
That's right. And it's and people don't really know how to sort of respond or how to read the sort of body language. Or just today I had a conversation with people who somebody'd seen the fox population seems to sort of be expanding in my neighborhood. And seeing foxes very frequently. Like, well, are they dangerous? Do I call animal control? And
we got to call someone.
And then you sort of have to say, well, no, they're sort of native animals, and they do really well in cities, and unless you're a kitten or a rat, you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah, someone call. We get calls, as you can imagine, and working for the park.
Oh, right, yeah.
So people call, and I'm kind of getting a reputation as like the wildlife guy. So people calling specifically for me.
Nice.
And I'm just like, guys, like, it's funny. This guy's actually in Upper Darby, but I guess Upper Darby's wildlife people. Yeah. But he's next to Goskey Park, right? So I'm like, there's a fox on the lawn chair on my porch. I'm like,
sleeping.
I'm like, it's why is he there? Like, because it's probably comfortable.
Yeah.
And you can always look at and we'll link to it, like Christian's fabulous Flickr feed I always keep going back to the Hawks, but there's a lot of fun stuff in there. Yeah, so if you like the podcast, please rate us on your podcasting platform of choice. Feel free to drop us a note with feedback, suggestions, etc. at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. Tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. Hit us up on Facebook. If you've got any ideas, let us know. We love it when you record stuff and send it to us to put on the air. Or not the air, put on the web. Christian, now Urban Hawk groups, what's next for you?
Well, probably turning the Urban Hawk stuff into a book, I think.